submitted two papers to the Association for Baha'i Studies. One I submitted was called Achieving Peace Through Education. I looked at the theme of the conference and I thought this is a perfect paper. It's a paper I had developed for the International Council on Education for Teaching. And so I submitted that, and a week later I thought, well, I have this idea about absolute poverty and utter nothingness. Let me just send it along to show them that I'm very serious about presenting, and so I did that. And a couple months later, I got the letter back from the association and said, your paper had been accepted. And I thought, fine. And I read on a little bit, and there it was, utter poverty and absolute poverty and utter nothingness. I had expected them to choose the first paper, which I had presented at the International Council for Education in Jamaica just last month. So I called on a couple of my friends trying to employ the Baha'i principle of consultation to help me get this all together. And I got a few good suggestions, a couple I'd like to share with you. One was that I submit the paper and attach the title page to a bunch of blank pages and send it in. The other was that I get up in front of the audience and say, today my topic is absolute poverty and utter nothingness, the goal of education, and then sit down. Well, I stopped using consultation at that point and decided to hit the books and present to you what I feel is a very key issue and a new idea in the area of education. And it's interesting listening to Dr. Eifert and Ms. Gandhi's speech today, as I feel absolute poverty and utter nothingness relate to it very much. Dr. Eifert is talking about the areas of values, human relations, and images, and I think absolute poverty and utter nothingness meets all of those categories. Ms. Gandhi is speaking about the goal of education and the spiritual attitudes that are needed, and I feel that, again, absolute poverty and utter nothingness are a spiritual goal and an attitude that we can adopt. Absolute poverty and utter nothingness has been proposed as the ultimate goal of education and the highest state of consciousness by the greatest seers, prophets, and philosophers of the world. Poverty and nothingness refers to a condition of being free of self and worldly attachments. For centuries, the great individuals of both East and West have called us to this higher reality. Baha'u'llah named this mystical condition or station as poverty and nothingness. In the Seven Valleys, Baha'u'llah's mystical description of the stages that mark the wayfarer's journey from the abode of dust to the heavenly homeland, the seventh stage or valley is called the Valley of True Poverty and Absolute Nothingness. He describes these stages in these words. This station is the dying from self and the living in God, the being poor in self and rich in the desired one. Poverty, as here referred to, signifieth being poor in the things of the created world, rich in the things of God's world. He who hath attained this station is sanctified from all that pertaineth to the world. For whatever the creatures have is limited by their own limits, and whatever the true one hath is sanctified therefrom. In the Hidden Words, Baha'u'llah explains how this condition of poverty and nothingness requires one to be free of self and worldly passions. He says, free thyself from the fetters of this world and loose thy soul from the prison of self. And the candle of thine heart is lighted by the hand of my power. Quench it not with the contrary winds of self and passion. And wouldst thou have me, seek none other than me. And wouldst thou gaze upon my beauty, close thine eyes to the world and all that is therein. For my will and the will of another than me, even as fire and water, cannot dwell in one heart. The self and the world, as here used, refer to the lower self and those things that keep one from God. As long as one is filled with self and worldly attachments, there will be no place for enlightenment and energy that comes from God. Abdu'l-Baha speaks about this. He says, Then know, O thou virtuous soul, that as soon as thou becomest separated from aught else save God, and dost cut thyself from the worldly things, thy heart will shine with the lights of divinity and with the effulgence of the Sun of Truth from the horizon of the realm of might. And then thou wilt be filled by the Spirit of power from God and become capable of doing that which thou desirest. And in another place he says, I now assure thee, O servant of God, that if thy mind become empty and pure from every mention and thought, and thy heart attracted wholly to the kingdom of God, forget all else besides God, and come in communion with the Spirit of God, then the Holy Spirit will assist thee with a power which will enable thee to penetrate all things, and a dazzling spark which enlightens all sides. A brilliant flame in the zenith of the heavens will teach thee that which thou dost not know of the facts of the universe and of divine doctrine. In our short obligatory prayer revealed by Baha'u'llah, he gives both the purpose of man and the necessary attitude, powerlessness and poverty, for achieving that purpose. I bear witness, O my God, that thou hast created me to know thee and to worship thee. I testify at this moment to my powerlessness and to thy might, to my poverty and to thy wealth. Poverty and nothingness are intimately linked with our purpose and goal of life, to know and love God. The prophets of God have all tried to guide mankind to this truth. Baha'u'llah said, the purpose underlying their revelation hath been to educate all men, that they may, at the hour of death, ascend in the utmost purity and sanctity, and with absolute detachment, to the throne of the Most High. This education goes beyond our limited conceptions of education to include the ultimate purpose and reality of man. Most education today can be characterized as material education, that which relates primarily to the self and to the world. The education spoken of by Baha'u'llah and the prophets and philosophers of the old have transcended this narrow view of man, and it requires an awareness of the limitations of our worldly knowledge. Baha'u'llah said, blind thine eyes, that thou mayest behold my beauty. Stop thine ears, that thou mayest hearken unto the sweet melody of my voice. Empty thyself of all learning, that thou mayest partake of my knowledge, and sanctify thyself from riches, that thou mayest obtain a lasting share from the ocean of my eternal wealth. Blind thine eyes, that is, to all save my beauty. Stop thine ears to all save my word. Empty thyself of all learning, save the knowledge of me, that with a clear vision, a pure heart, and an attentive ear, thou mayest enter the court of my holiness. Poverty and nothingness and its relationship to understanding and wisdom is also explained by Baha'u'llah in the words of wisdom. The essence of understanding is to testify to one's poverty. The essence of wisdom is the fear of God. You can find very similar verses to these in the Bible and in the Quran. The fear of God is an expression of our understanding and recognizing our nothingness. In relation to God, we are truly poor and nothing. This goal of poverty and nothingness is not new with Baha'u'llah. It has been proclaimed by the greatest prophets and philosophers of old, those who have had a profound effect on the world's greatest civilizations. In his first volume of works entitled The Great Philosophers, one of the preeminent philosophers of today, Karl Jaspers, identifies what he feels are the most influential people in the history of the world. From all the people who have ever lived, he believes that four stand out from all others in the effect their lives have had on the course of human thought and history. He calls these four paradigmatic individuals. A paradigm is a pattern or example. These four individuals serve as examples or paradigms to humanity, and their teachings are models that have had the greatest influence on the history of man. They are Socrates, Buddha, Confucius, and Jesus. Jasper says this about them. The four paradigmatic individuals have exerted a historical influence of incomparable scope and depth. Other men of great stature may have equally important for smaller groups, but when it comes to a broad, enduring influence over many hundreds of years, they are so far above others that they must be singled out if we are to form a clear view of the world's history. No single type can account for these four men. Their historicity and consequent uniqueness can be perceived only within the all-embracing historicity of humanity, which in each of them expresses itself in a wholly different way. To discover this common root has been possible only since mankind has achieved a unity of communication, and the different cultures have learned from each other's crucial individuals. In an earlier day, each one was the only crucial individual for large parts of mankind, and as a matter of fact, have remained so even since the others became known. Jaspers feels that only one other person could be compared to these four individuals based on his historical influence. That person is Muhammad. The impact and quality of Muhammad's life, evidenced by the effects he has had on present-day thought and civilization, qualifies him to be regarded as one of the greatest individuals in human history. These five individuals represent the greatest philosophical and religious ideologies of both the East and the West. Besides Confucius, they wrote nothing. They all suffered because of their ideas, and two were put to death because of their teachings. Each of these individuals taught and lived the ideal of absolute poverty and utter nothingness in different ways and to different extents. Each proposed that the highest state of consciousness was the overcoming of self and worldly attachments and limitations. Socrates called it ignorance, Buddha, emptiness, Confucius, awareness of limits, Jesus, faith, and Muhammad, submission. I'd like to speak to you now and look at each one of these individuals and deal with their concepts and show how it relates to poverty and nothingness. To begin with Socrates. Socrates lived 24 centuries ago in the Greek city of Athens. He was not a prophet, nor did he make such a claim. But he felt he had a divine mission to question unrelentingly in search of knowledge of the true and good. In his dialogues with his fellow Athenians, Socrates forced them to re-examine knowledge that they took for granted. Socrates believed that one must be aware of his own ignorance before he can learn something new. In the Meno, Socrates shows how insight grows from perplexity and the state of recognizing one's own ignorance as he questions a slave on a mathematical problem. Socrates himself claimed to be ignorant. In the Apology, Socrates sets out to find somebody wiser than he is, because he is perplexed by the Oracle of Delphi's statement that he is the wisest person. In his dialectical encounters with the supposedly wise men of his day, the politicians, the poets, and the artisans, he found them not wise at all, but blinded by their own false knowledge. Because of their pride, fear, and attachment to their own knowledge, they put barriers between themselves and truth. Socrates was wiser than these men because he was aware of his ignorance. In the Republic, I think Socrates, and it's written by Plato, as I told you, Socrates wrote nothing. I think this idea of ignorance is expressed very well in Book 7, where he talks about the idea, the metaphor of people in a cave. These people are chained in a cave, and they necks are held so that all they can see is the wall of the cave. Behind them is a fire, and people will walk in between that fire and shadows will come upon the wall. And these people are carrying statues of animals and images. And the reality those people have who are chained and facing the wall is only those shadows. And a learned man in that society is the man who can quickly identify the shadows and knows their forms and can tell you characteristics about those shadows. He goes on to explain, for instance, if a man through some natural cause should be broken loose from these chains and should be able to turn around and see the fire and to see these images, he could not relate to that. He could not consider that reality because all he has ever seen are those shadows. That is truth. That's what his society supports, and the wise men of his society say this is what is reality. Now, if that person should be able to overcome his own ignorance, his own limitations, his own limited view of reality, and be able to accept, gradually by looking and seeing, well, there's a shadow, but that shadow was made by that image, that's a real image, and that image is a result of the fire. Gradually to overcome his own ignorance to achieve reality, and slowly to ascend from the cave until he can gaze into the light. Socrates goes on to explain, now if that very person, having seen the light, wants to go back to his people and to rescue them from their shadows and their images and their ignorance, they will not accept him. They will reject him. And a matter of fact, when he goes down, he's going to be blinded by the light. He's not going to be able to adapt to their ignorance and to their shadows, and they're going to think him a fool. And we must also look at our reality as this physical world is just a shadow, and that the real world is in another plane that we have cut ourselves off from. Socrates felt that one must use more than reason in coming to knowledge. He tells of a voice that spoke to him throughout his life and gave him knowledge and understanding. Socrates said that self-knowledge is really the knowledge of God, and a man can only approach the divine through leaving behind earthly passions. Socrates' influence has endured throughout the centuries and can be found in many of the great works of Western thought. Next, I'd like to deal with Buddha. Buddha talked about emptiness. Gautama the Buddha, or the Enlightened One, lived near the Himalayas about 500 BC. Buddha was raised in wealth and luxury, but left this behind in his search for truth. He practiced ascetic self-denial, but later adopted the middle way between self-mortification and worldly ambition as the path of salvation. Buddhism has probably had more adherents than any other religion or philosophy in history. Buddha's Four Noble Truths summarize his teachings. 1, life involves suffering. 2, the cause of suffering is desire. 3, the elimination of desire leads to cessation of suffering. And 4, the elimination of desire is the result of following the Noble Eightfold Path. This path consists of the right mode of seeing things, right thought, right speech, right action, right way of living, right effort, right-mindedness, and right meditation. In other words, suffering is caused by not understanding reality and by a preoccupation with worldly and selfish desires. If we can rise above our ignorant cravings and our selfish desires, we can find oneness, happiness, and peace. The final stage of the Noble Eightfold Path is called right meditation. This has been characterized as emptying oneself so that our sensual cravings and vain imaginings can be squarely faced and dealt with. Only when we reach the state of right meditation, or emptiness of self and limited worldly learnings, can we achieve nirvana. Nirvana is also called sunyata, or emptiness. This condition is far beyond the relaxation or meditative states achieved through simple physical and mental techniques. It leads to a state of awakening or enlightenment. Daisetsu Taro Suzuki, recognized as the foremost interpreter of Zen Buddhism in the West, states, according to the Buddhist scholars, this phenomenal world is an aggregate. existence made up of conditions, and not a self-existing reality. When the mind is said to have attained dissolution, it means the mind has entered into a state of absolute emptiness, that it is complete from all conditionalities, that is, transcendence. In other words, the mind gains its ultimate reality, being now above birth and death, self and not self, good and evil. Not only did Buddha teach these concepts, but his life was a realization of them. His system of knowledge did not rely on sense perception only and logical operations or empirical proof, but on the transformations of consciousness and the stages of meditation. It requires a new way of thinking for the modern Western mind. Buddha's concepts of emptiness and freedom from self and the world result in a tolerance for others that allows the veils of ignorance and illusion to be removed. Confucius talked about the awareness of limits. Confucius lived about 2,500 years ago. Basically, he thought that we should be aware of our own limits, that he didn't think complete knowledge was possible. One of the errors of men was not to see their own faults and ignorance. On questions about metaphysics, Confucius was unwilling to give answers that limited ultimate reality. He thought it was impossible to speak objectively about things that were not objects. Confucius did not consider himself a saint or even a prophet or a religious leader. He was interested in improving the human condition. His statement, "When you do not know a thing, to acknowledge that you do not know it is knowledge," might be considered one of the first formulations of scientific thinking. Jesus lived about 2,000 years ago in the Middle East. He taught that this physical world was nothing compared to the spiritual world. Jesus exemplified his teachings by sacrificing worldly desires for his spiritual mission. The path to salvation involved resisting the temptations of this limited world and advancing towards the kingdom of heaven. He spoke much of love. Love free of self and the world is the ultimate condition. Jesus stressed belief and faith over reason and tradition. One's abilities are only limited by one's belief and faith. This faith leads to heaven and a freeing of worldly cares. Jesus taught that knowledge was achieved through faith. He spoke of people hearing and seeing, yet not understanding. He praised the poor and lowly because they were receptive to the truth. The learned and wealthy rejected his teachings because they were blinded by their own knowledge and attachment. Jesus taught the importance of poverty. This poverty included material poverty, but was concerned more with its spiritual reality. He spoke of how hard it was for a wealthy person to enter heaven, and in the Beatitudes extolled the station of the poor and the meek. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall enter the kingdom of heaven. In the same sense, Jesus said we must become like children to enter the kingdom of God. Children are the essence of poverty and nothingness, and I believe this is one of the reasons children learn so rapidly at early stages of development. They haven't gotten all these attachments that we have, and so they're very receptive. Now, if through our maturity we can again achieve that state of poverty and nothingness, I think we open ourselves up to worlds of learning that we have cut ourselves off from. I'm going to simplify and cut short some of this because of time. Deal with very briefly Muhammad. He was the founder of Islam. Islam means the submission of God to the will of God, and this is the central tenet of his teaching. Submission to the will of God requires detachment from our own will and limited knowledge. God transcends all things, and only by submitting our will to his will can we discover truth and freedom. Muslims, the ones who submit to God, are God-centered and believe everything comes from God. The most well-known of the Muslim mystics are the Sufis. And Faridun Din Attar was one of the greatest of these Sufi poets, and he wrote about the stages of the journey of the soul in a book called The Parliament of the Birds. In these stages, he spoke of the valleys that the birds must traverse in quest of their king. I won't go into all those valleys because of time, but the final valley is called annihilation or death. And this represents the highest state of understanding and reality and the highest level of Islamic submission to the will of God. The knowledge of each of these great men by the learned of their times was discounted and rejected. They were not listened to. The people were blinded by their own ignorance and knowledge, and they were held back from the truth brought by Socrates, Buddha, Confucius, Jesus, and Mohammed. People rose up against them, even though they expressed the ultimate state of learning and development. They expressed it in different terms, but it all means the same thing. We must rid ourselves of self and worldly attachment. This must be regarded as the goal of complete education. Socratic ignorance, Buddhist right meditation and emptiness, Confucian awareness of limits, Christian faith in poverty, and Islamic submission and annihilation are all expressions of the same truth: absolute poverty and utter nothingness. Parallels between the thoughts and lives of these great individuals and Baha'u'llah's concepts are apparent. The concept of detachment from self and the world is the ultimate state in the approach to God or a higher reality. As such, it is a unifying concept for the peoples of the world and a unifying goal for education. Absolute poverty and utter nothingness is the ultimate goal of education and the need for this day and for peace. I would like to leave you with a verse from the Masnavi by Rumi. It goes like this: the death of self is needed here, not rhetoric. Be nothing then, and walk upon the wave. Thank you.